Well, the clock is counting down the hours for Teresa Lewis. She is set to become the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century. 10 on your side's Jason Marks is live at the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, where Lewis is scheduled to die in about 3 hours. Jason?
And Tom, right now Lewis could be having her final meal. She requested fried chicken, sweet peas, and a Dr. Pepper. All of her appeals have been denied, and right now she has no more options.
On the evening of September 2010, inside Virginia's Greensville Correctional Center, Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis lay strapped to a gurney. At exactly 9:13 p.m., the Commonwealth of Virginia carried out her execution by lethal injection. She was 41 years old, the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century, and the only woman put to death in the United States in that decade. The irony was heavy. Teresa was not the triggerman in the murders that brought her here. The two young men who fired the shotguns that killed her husband and stepson were serving life sentences. Yet prosecutors argued that Teresa was the mastermind, the one who opened the door, funded the weapons, and promised a share of the insurance money. For that, she alone faced the needle. Her case sparked fierce controversy. With an IQ of 72 and a dependent personality disorder, critics said she was more follower than leader, easily manipulated by the very men she allegedly controlled. But courts disagreed, pointing to her planning, her lies, and her confessions. Appeals wound their way through the system, drawing international attention, from human rights groups, from best-selling author John Grisham, even from political leaders overseas. But mercy never came. When the execution chamber doors opened, Teresa Lewis prayed softly, apologized to the victims' families, and asked for forgiveness. Moments later, witnesses saw her body fall still. Her journey from a troubled young woman to the first female execution in modern Virginia law spanned years of legal battles, psychiatric evaluations, and public protests. But the crime itself remained unforgettable. A husband and his son, gunned down in their own beds for money, betrayal, and a chance at freedom that never came. To understand how Teresa Lewis became the most controversial condemned woman in America, how a shotgun blast in a quiet Virginia farmhouse led to international outrage, and why her case still fuels debate about justice, mercy, and the death penalty, we have to go back. Back to October 30th, 2002. Back to a rural home in Pittsylvania County. Back to the night when Julian and Charles Lewis were murdered, and the conspiracy that unraveled everything. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, the darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Teresa Wilson was born on April 26, 1969, in Danville, Virginia, a small textile town where opportunity was scarce and poverty was common. Her parents both worked long hours at the local textile mill, struggling to make ends meet, in a community where most families faced similar challenges. From an early age, Teresa found comfort in music. She sang in the church choir, her voice carrying through the small sanctuary where community members gathered each Sunday. The church became her refuge, a place where she felt valued and heard. Her singing was one of the few things that brought her recognition in a life otherwise marked by struggle. At 16, Teresa made a decision that would shape her future. She dropped out of high school and married a man she had met at church. The young couple welcomed a daughter, Christy Lynn Bean, but their marriage quickly crumbled under the weight of financial stress and immaturity. The divorce left Teresa as a single mother with limited education and few prospects. Following the end of her marriage, Teresa began a downward spiral. She turned to alcohol and prescription painkillers to cope with her circumstances. Her former mother-in-law, Marie Bean, would later describe Teresa as not right, suggesting that even those closest to her recognized something was troubling about her mental state and decision-making abilities. Teresa's work history told the story of someone unable to find stability. She moved between dozens of low-paying jobs, never able to establish herself in any career. Employers found her unreliable, and she struggled to maintain steady employment. This pattern of instability would continue for years, creating a cycle of financial desperation that seemed impossible to break. The combination of substance abuse, financial stress, and limited intellectual capacity created a dangerous situation. Teresa was vulnerable to manipulation and poor decision-making. She craved acceptance and stability, making her susceptible to anyone who might offer her what appeared to be a better life. In the spring of 2000, Teresa finally found steady work at the Dan River Textile Mill, the same type of facility where her parents had spent their careers. It was here that she would meet Julian Clifton Lewis Jr., her supervisor, who would become her second husband. At 31 years old, Teresa believed she had finally found the stability she had been seeking her entire life. But Teresa's past had left deep scars. Her dependent personality and history of poor choices had not disappeared with her new job. The prescription painkiller addiction continued. You see, following the divorce, Teresa began the downward spiral that would define her 20s. She turned to alcohol as a way to numb the emotional pain of rejection and abandonment. The prescription painkillers began as a legitimate prescription for chronic back pain that had developed from years of physical labor and the stress of carrying and delivering Christy at such a young age. Teresa's back problems were real and debilitating. The combination of poor nutrition during her teenage pregnancy, the physical demands of the low-wage jobs she worked, and her body's inability to properly recover had created genuine chronic pain. A doctor prescribed Percocet for what was initially intended as short-term relief. But Teresa discovered that the medication did more than ease her physical discomfort. It provided relief not just from physical pain, but from the emotional anguish that had consumed her life since her divorce. For the first time in months, Teresa could function without the constant weight of depression and anxiety. The pills allowed her to feel normal, capable, even optimistic about her future. This psychological relief proved far more addictive than the physical pain relief. What began as taking medication as prescribed quickly escalated into taking extra pills on particularly difficult days. The medication also impaired Teresa's already limited judgment and decision-making abilities. The combination of her low IQ, dependent personality disorder, and the cognitive effects of chronic opioid use created a perfect storm of vulnerability. She became even more susceptible to manipulation by others and less capable of recognizing dangerous or exploitative situations. Julian Clifton Lewis Jr., Teresa's supervisor, had recently lost his wife of nearly 30 years and was struggling with grief and loneliness when he met Teresa at the textile mill in March 2000. The 50-year-old supervisor found comfort in Teresa's attention and apparent devotion, while Teresa saw in Julian the stability and security she had craved her entire adult life. Their relationship moved quickly. By June 2000, Teresa and her 16-year-old daughter Christy had moved into Julian's home. The marriage that followed created an instant blended family that included Julian's 3 children from his first marriage: Jason, Charles, and Kathy. For Teresa, this represented the family stability she had always sought, but the adjustment period proved challenging for everyone involved. Julian's children were still grieving their mother's death and struggled to accept their father's new wife. Teresa's daughter Christy brought her own behavioral problems into the household, creating additional stress. Despite these challenges, Julian was committed to making the marriage work and providing a stable home for his new family. The prescription painkiller addiction that had plagued Teresa for years continued even after her marriage to Julian. She had learned to hide her dependency, but the drugs continued to impair her judgment and emotional stability. Julian, focused on his own grief and the challenges of blending their families, may not have fully recognized the extent of Teresa's substance abuse problems. Teresa's dependent personality disorder manifested in her intense need for approval and guidance from others. She looked to Julian to make most decisions for the family, struggling to function independently even in routine matters. This dependency, which Julian may have initially seen as devotion, masked deeper psychological problems that made Teresa vulnerable to manipulation. In December 2001, tragedy struck the Lewis family when Julian's older son Jason died in a car accident while serving in the U.S. Navy. The $200,000 life insurance settlement that followed Jason's death brought both grief and financial opportunity to the family. Julian used the money responsibly, purchasing a 5-acre plot of land in Pittsylvania County and a manufactured home where he and Teresa could build their future together. The isolated property represented Julian's hopes for a peaceful retirement with his new wife, but the seclusion would later prove dangerous. Teresa seemed content with their new home, but her underlying psychological vulnerabilities remained unchanged. She continued to crave external validation and remained susceptible to influence by anyone who might offer her attention or excitement. Charles Lewis, Julian's younger son, was serving with the Army Reserves and preparing for deployment to Iraq. As a responsible soldier, he obtained a $250,000 life insurance policy, naming his father as primary beneficiary and his stepmother Teresa as secondary beneficiary. This decision, meant as a gesture of family acceptance, would later provide the motive for his murder. Throughout 2001 and early 2002, Teresa maintained the appearance of a devoted wife and stepmother while privately struggling with ongoing addiction and psychological dependency. She had learned to present herself as caring and responsible, but her fundamental vulnerabilities had not changed. The stage was being set for decisions that would ultimately lead to tragedy. As Teresa began this new chapter of her life at the textile mill and in her marriage to Julian, she carried with her all the vulnerabilities and poor coping mechanisms that had defined her first 30 years. The dependent personality disorder, substance abuse problems, and desperate need for acceptance that had characterized her earlier life remained unchanged beneath the surface of apparent stability. By fall 2002, Teresa Lewis appeared to have achieved the stable life she had always sought. She had a steady job, a devoted husband, a comfortable home on their own property, and acceptance into Julian's family. To outside observers, she seemed to be a woman who had overcome her troubled past and built a respectable, middle-class existence. But Teresa's quiet routine of work, home, and church left her craving something more exciting than her predictable life provided. Despite having everything she had once thought would make her happy, Teresa found herself restless and searching for the kind of intense attention and validation that had always made her feel truly alive. Her shopping trips to local stores had become one of the few breaks in her routine that offered the possibility of something different. Teresa enjoyed these excursions to Walmart and other retail establishments, not just for the practical necessity of purchasing household items, but for the brief social interactions they provided. In checkout lines and store aisles, she could engage in conversations with strangers who didn't know her history, who might see her as interesting or desirable. It was during one of these routine shopping trips in the fall of 2002 that Teresa's carefully constructed stable life would intersect with forces that would destroy everything she had built. 21-year-old Matthew Jesse Schallenberger had ambitions that far exceeded his circumstances in rural Virginia. Unlike many young men his age who worked local jobs or joined the military, Matthew harbored fantasies about becoming something much more dangerous. He dreamed of becoming a professional killer, specifically a mafia-style hitman who could command respect and money through violence. Matthew's intelligence set him apart from his peers. With an IQ of 113, he was significantly smarter than average and used this intelligence to manipulate others around him. He understood people's weaknesses and knew how to exploit them for his own gain. His criminal aspirations were not random acts of violence, but calculated plans to build what he saw as a profitable career in murder. The young man's ultimate goal was to establish himself in New York's criminal underworld. He believed that if he could build a reputation as a reliable killer, he could work his way up to the major leagues of organized crime. To fund this dream, Matthew planned to create a drug distribution network, seeing this as his pathway to both immediate money and long-term criminal connections. Matthew shared his living space with 19-year-old Rodney Lamont Fuller, a younger man who seemed to follow Matthew's lead in most matters. Rodney was less intelligent and less driven than his roommate, but he was willing to participate in whatever schemes Matthew devised. The two lived together in a mobile home, spending their time planning crimes and discussing their futures in illegal activities. While Matthew was the clear leader of the pair, Rodney proved to be an eager accomplice. He looked up to Matthew and was willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain their friendship and criminal partnership. This dynamic would prove crucial in the events that followed, as Matthew's manipulative abilities extended beyond their relationship to other vulnerable people they would encounter. The fall of 2002 marked a turning point for both young men. They had been living on the margins of society, supporting themselves through small-time criminal activities and odd jobs, but they were ready for something bigger. Matthew's impatience with small-scale crime was growing, and he began looking for opportunities that could provide the significant money he needed to launch his criminal career. Their routine trips to local stores and businesses were not just about daily necessities. Matthew was constantly evaluating potential targets and opportunities. He studied people, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. His intelligence allowed him to quickly assess whether someone might be useful to his plans or vulnerable to his manipulation. When Matthew and Rodney encountered people during their daily activities, Matthew was already calculating how he might use them. He had developed a skill for identifying individuals who were emotionally or financially desperate, recognizing that such people could be convinced to participate in criminal activities if approached correctly. The two men's criminal relationship was built on Matthew's leadership and Rodney's willingness to follow orders. This partnership had already involved them in various illegal activities, but nothing approaching the scale of what Matthew was planning. They were ready to graduate from petty crime to something much more serious. As autumn arrived in 2002, Matthew and Rodney were preparing to take their criminal activities to a new level. Matthew's plans for establishing himself as a professional killer were about to move from fantasy to reality. The opportunity he had been waiting for would present itself in the most ordinary of settings, during a routine shopping trip that would change multiple lives forever. Their path was about to intersect with someone whose vulnerabilities perfectly matched Matthew's predatory instincts. Teresa Lewis, with her dependent personality disorder and desperate need for acceptance, would prove to be exactly the type of vulnerable individual that Matthew had been seeking. The Walmart in Danville, Virginia, was like thousands of others across America. A busy retail center where ordinary people went about their daily shopping routines. In the fall of 2002, this unremarkable location became the setting for a meeting that would lead to multiple murders and change several lives forever. Teresa Lewis was going through the checkout line when she first encountered Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller. What seemed like casual conversation between strangers quickly developed into something more significant. Matthew, with his keen ability to read people, immediately recognized Teresa as someone who could be useful to him. During their brief conversation, Matthew assessed Teresa's vulnerabilities with practiced skill. He noticed her eagerness to please, her apparent loneliness, and signs of the financial stress that had marked her entire adult life. Matthew understood that Teresa was someone who craved attention and stability, making her an ideal target for manipulation. Teresa gave Matthew her phone number, a decision that seemed innocent at the time but would prove to have devastating consequences. Within days, their casual encounter had developed into a sexual relationship. Matthew moved quickly to establish control over Teresa, using charm and attention to make her dependent on him emotionally. The relationship escalated rapidly from casual contact to passionate involvement. Teresa, starved for attention and affection, fell completely under Matthew's influence. He told her what she wanted to hear, made her feel special and desired, and convinced her that he genuinely cared about her welfare. This manipulation was entirely calculated on Matthew's part, Matthew soon learned about Teresa's marriage to Julian Lewis and her position as secondary beneficiary on her stepson Charles's life insurance policy. With his criminal mind, Matthew immediately recognized the potential financial opportunity this represented. He began subtly exploring Teresa's feelings about her marriage and her family situation. Teresa confided in Matthew about her marital problems, claiming that Julian was dominant and controlling. Whether these complaints were genuine or encouraged by Matthew's questioning, they provided him with the justification he needed for the plan that was forming in his mind. Matthew presented himself as Teresa's protector and savior from an unhappy situation. The sexual relationship expanded to include Rodney Fuller, creating a triangle that gave both men additional control over Teresa. She was willing to accommodate both men sexually, demonstrating the extent to which they had manipulated her into compliance with their desires. This sexual control was another tool Matthew used to ensure Teresa's cooperation. Within weeks of their first meeting, Matthew had completely assessed Teresa's situation and developed his plan. He learned about Julian's $200,000 insurance settlement from his deceased son Jason, as well as Charles's $250,000 military life insurance policy. Matthew calculated that if both Julian and Charles died, Teresa would inherit substantial money as the secondary beneficiary. Matthew's plan was methodical and patient. He spent time building Teresa's trust and dependence on him while gathering information about her family's finances and routines. He presented the idea of killing Julian gradually, making it seem like the solution to Teresa's marital problems rather than his own criminal scheme. The manipulation was so complete that Teresa believed the murder plan was partly her idea, when in reality Matthew had carefully guided her to this conclusion. He used her emotional dependence on him, her substance abuse problems, and her limited intellectual capacity to convince her that murder was their only option for happiness together. By October 2002, Matthew had everything in place for his plan. Teresa was completely under his control. Rodney was ready to participate as his accomplice, and they had detailed information about the intended victim's schedules and financial assets. The stage was set for Matthew to take his first step toward his dream of becoming a professional killer, using Teresa as both his entry point and his cover for the crimes that would follow. In October 2002, Charles came home for what would be his final leave before deployment. This visit was meant to be a time for him to spend with family, handle any remaining personal business, and prepare mentally for the challenges of military service in a combat zone. Charles looked forward to seeing his father and stepmother, having no reason to suspect that his presence created danger for both himself and his father. Charles's military training had taught him to be aware of potential threats, but those lessons focused on foreign enemies and combat situations. Nothing in his experience had prepared him to recognize that the greatest threat to his life would come from within his own family, from someone he had accepted and trusted as his stepmother. During his leave, Charles stayed in the family's home on the 5-acre property his father had purchased with insurance money from Jason's death. The property seemed safe and secluded, a peaceful place where Charles could relax before heading to the uncertainties of military deployment. The isolation that made the property appealing to Julian also made it perfect for the crime that was being planned. Teresa appeared supportive and caring toward Charles during his visit, giving no indication of the deadly plot she had already set in motion. Her ability to maintain this facade while planning his murder demonstrated the calculated nature of the conspiracy and her complete commitment to the plan Matthew Schallenberger had developed. Charles's military training and physical fitness meant that killing him would require careful planning and overwhelming force. The conspirators knew they would need weapons and the element of surprise to successfully murder a trained soldier. Charles's presence in the house during his leave provided the opportunity they had been waiting for. On October 23, 2002, Teresa withdrew $1,200 from the bank and gave this money to Matthew and Rodney to purchase firearms and ammunition. This transaction represented Teresa's full commitment to the murder plot. She was no longer just talking about killing her husband and stepson. She was providing the financial resources to make it happen. The first attempt to kill Julian failed when the conspirators tried to murder him while he was away from home. This failure required them to adjust their plan and wait for another opportunity. The fact that they continued with their plan after the first failure showed their determination to commit these murders, regardless of the risks involved. Teresa's behavior during the planning phase revealed the extent of her manipulation and psychological control by Matthew. She arranged for her 16-year-old daughter, Christy, to have sexual contact with Rodney Fuller, demonstrating how completely she had abandoned normal moral boundaries. This decision showed that Teresa was willing to sacrifice anyone, including her own child, to advance the murder plan. The conspirators spent time rehearsing their plan and ensuring that every detail was covered. As October 30th approached, Teresa was fully committed to the murder plan, despite having multiple opportunities to withdraw or seek help. October 30th, 2002 was the night before Halloween, but the evil that visited the Lewis home was far more real than any fictional horror story. Teresa Lewis had spent the evening maintaining her normal routine, giving her husband and stepson no indication that this would be their last night alive. Teresa then prayed with Julian before they went to bed, a routine that demonstrated the complete disconnection between her public behavior and her deadly intentions. After their prayer, Teresa and Julian lay down together in their bed, with Julian having no idea that his wife had already arranged for his murder. Around 3:15 a.m., Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller approached the manufactured home on the Lewis property. The isolated location provided perfect cover for their crime, with no nearby neighbors to witness their arrival or hear the gunshots that would follow. Teresa had left the back door unlocked as planned, allowing the killers easy access to the house. Before the killers entered, Teresa got out of bed and moved to the kitchen, positioning herself away from the bedrooms where the murders would take place. She also secured the family's pit bull in a bedroom to prevent the dog from interfering with the crime. Matthew entered Julian's bedroom while Julian was sleeping and defenseless. The older man awoke to find a gunman standing over him, but had no time to defend himself or escape. Matthew shot Julian multiple times with a shotgun, causing devastating injuries that would prove fatal within hours. While Matthew was murdering Julian, Rodney Fuller went to Charles's bedroom. The young soldier was also asleep and had no opportunity to use his military training to defend himself. Rodney shot Charles 3 times with a shotgun, hitting him in the chest, abdomen, back, face, and neck. When Rodney discovered that Charles was still alive after the initial shooting, he returned to finish the job. Rodney retrieved Matthew's shotgun and shot Charles 2 more times, ensuring that the young soldier would die from his wounds. This deliberate second attack showed the cold-blooded determination of the killers. During the murders, Teresa remained in the kitchen, listening to the gunshots that were ending the lives of her husband and stepson. Rather than calling for help or trying to intervene, she waited for the killers to complete their work. After the shootings, Teresa entered Julian's bedroom and retrieved his wallet while he was still alive and bleeding. She took $300 from the wallet and divided this money between Matthew and Rodney before they left the scene. This theft of money from her dying husband demonstrated the mercenary nature of her involvement in the crimes. Matthew kissed Teresa goodbye and apologized that she had to go through something like this, words that suggested the murders were somehow unfortunate rather than deliberate acts of violence they had all planned together. This false sympathy was part of Matthew's continued manipulation of Teresa, even after the murders were complete. Teresa then waited approximately 45 minutes before calling for help. Instead of immediately calling 911, Teresa made a series of calculated phone calls designed to establish her alibi and create the appearance that she was an innocent victim seeking help and comfort. These calls revealed both her consciousness of guilt and her attempt to manipulate others into supporting her false narrative about what had happened. The first call went to Marie Bean, Teresa's former mother-in-law from her first marriage. Marie had maintained a relationship with Teresa despite the troubled history, and Teresa knew that Marie would react with shock and sympathy to news of the murders. By calling Marie first, Teresa was ensuring that she would have a witness to her apparent distress and confusion. During the call to Marie Bean, Teresa's performance was carefully calculated to create the impression of a traumatized victim. She spoke in a voice that sounded shaken and confused, describing what she claimed was a home invasion by unknown intruders. Teresa told Marie that both Julian and Charles had been shot, but she did not reveal the extent of the violence or express appropriate urgency about getting medical help for Julian, who was still alive at this point. The second call went to Debbie Yates, Teresa's best friend and confidant. This call served multiple purposes in Teresa's plan. By contacting Debbie, Teresa was creating another witness to her supposed victimization while also seeking emotional support that would reinforce her false narrative. Debbie had been a close friend during Teresa's troubled years and would be expected to provide comfort and assistance during this crisis. Teresa's conversation with Debbie Yates followed a similar pattern to her call with Marie Bean. Throughout these phone calls, and the entire 45-minute delay, Julian Lewis continued to suffer from his gunshot wounds in the master bedroom. When Teresa finally called 911 at 3:55 a.m., her performance was carefully calibrated to create the impression of a traumatized victim reporting a shocking crime. However, investigators would later identify numerous inconsistencies in her account that suggested advanced knowledge of the murders and active participation in planning the attacks. Teresa told the 911 operator that unknown intruders had entered her home and shot her husband and stepson. She claimed that she had been hiding in the bathroom during the attack and had waited to call for help until she was sure the attackers had left. The manufactured home was now a crime scene, with Julian Lewis clinging to life in the master bedroom and Charles Lewis dead from multiple gunshot wounds in his own room. Before we continue with the twists and controversies of this case, take a moment to support the channel. Hit that like button if you're finding this breakdown informative, and subscribe to No Way Out for more real stories of crime, punishment, and the pursuit of justice. Now, let's get back to the case. Sheriff's deputies Harris Silverman and Corey Webb arrived at the Lewis home at approximately 4:18 a.m., just 23 minutes after Teresa's 911 call. When the deputies entered the home, they found Charles Lewis dead on the floor of his bedroom, his body riddled with shotgun wounds to his chest, abdomen, back, face, and neck. The violence of the attack was immediately apparent, with multiple shotgun shells scattered around the crime scene, providing evidence of the weapons used. In the master bedroom, Julian Lewis was still alive but barely conscious, suffering from multiple shotgun wounds to his abdomen. Deputy Webb spoke to Julian, who was able to provide his name and respond to questions despite his critical injuries. Julian's final words would prove crucial to the investigation that followed. When Deputy Webb asked Julian if he knew who had shot him, the dying man provided information that immediately cast doubt on Teresa's story. Julian clearly stated, "My wife knows who done this to me," directly contradicting Teresa's claim that unknown intruders had committed the murders. While deputies were trying to assist the victims, they observed Teresa talking on the telephone in another part of the house. Deputy Webb overheard her saying, "I told CJ about leaving that back door unlocked," a statement that suggested Teresa had knowledge about how the killers had gained access to the house. Julian Lewis died at the scene shortly after paramedics arrived, but not before providing investigators with the crucial information that his wife knew the identity of his killers. This deathbed statement would become a key piece of evidence in the case against Teresa and her conspirators. Teresa's initial story to investigators was that she had been awakened by a noise and saw someone standing at the end of her bed. She claimed she ran to the bathroom and barricaded herself inside while the shootings occurred. According to her account, she waited in the bathroom until she was sure the coast was clear before calling for help. Investigators immediately noticed problems with Teresa's story. Her demeanor while describing the supposed home invasion was unusually calm for someone who had just witnessed the murder of two family members. Most victims of such trauma show obvious signs of shock and distress, but Teresa appeared composed and in control. The timeline of events also raised red flags for investigators. The medical examiner's report showed that Charles had died around 3:15 a.m., but Teresa did not call 911 until 3:55 a.m. This 40-minute delay was difficult to explain if Teresa had really been hiding in the bathroom, especially since her loved ones were injured and dying. Teresa's behavior in the hours and days following the murders provided additional evidence of her involvement. Instead of focusing on funeral arrangements and family support, Teresa immediately began attempting to access her deceased husband's financial accounts and insurance policies. Within hours of the murders, Teresa called Julian's employer to report that he would not be coming to work because he was the victim of a homicide. She then asked when she could come in to collect his final paycheck, behavior that seemed inappropriately focused on money given the circumstances. Teresa also attempted to cash a $50,000 check from Julian's Prudential Securities account, presenting it at a local bank where employees noticed that the signature did not match Julian's authentic signature on file. When the bank refused to cash the forged check, Teresa caused a scene, drawing additional attention to her suspicious behavior. Investigators decided to bring Teresa in for additional questioning and a polygraph examination, recognizing that her story contained too many inconsistencies to be credible. During this interview, Teresa's carefully constructed lies began to fall apart under professional scrutiny. The polygraph test revealed that Teresa was being deceptive in her answers about the murders. When confronted with these results, Teresa began to provide additional information about what had really happened on the night of October 30th. Her admissions would lead investigators directly to the actual killers. When asked about who might have committed the murders, Teresa initially claimed she could not remember the name of the person she suspected. However, she eventually provided investigators with the first name, Matt, and quickly identified Matthew Schallenberger as someone she had met recently at a local store. Teresa admitted to having a sexual relationship with Matthew, though she initially tried to minimize the extent of their involvement. She described meeting him in a checkout line and giving him her phone number, leading to what she characterized as a casual relationship that had escalated quickly. As questioning continued, Teresa revealed that she had confided in Matthew about her marital problems, claiming that Julian was controlling and abusive. Whether these claims were true or simply part of the justification Teresa and Matthew had developed for murder, they provided insight into how the conspiracy had developed. Teresa eventually admitted that she knew Matthew was planning to kill Julian, but claimed she had done nothing to stop it. This admission represented a significant step beyond her original story of unknown intruders, acknowledging that she had advanced knowledge of the murder plan. Armed with Teresa's identification of Matthew Schallenberger, investigators moved quickly to locate and question him. Matthew initially denied any involvement in the murders, but agreed to allow police to search his residence. This decision would prove to be a critical mistake that provided investigators with the physical evidence they needed. During the search of Matthew's home, investigators found multiple shotguns, including weapons that contained shells matching those found at the crime scene. They also discovered 2 pairs of yellow rubber gloves in Matthew's closet, suggesting preparation for crimes that would involve avoiding fingerprint evidence. When confronted with this physical evidence, Matthew refused to provide any statement to investigators. However, Teresa continued to cooperate and eventually revealed that there had been a second shooter involved in the murders. She identified Rodney Fuller as Matthew's accomplice and provided information about his role in the conspiracy. Rodney Fuller was arrested and immediately chose to cooperate fully with investigators. His confession provided detailed information about the planning and execution of the murders, confirming Teresa's role as the person who had initiated and financed the conspiracy. According to Fuller's statement, Teresa had set up the entire murder-for-hire plot so she could collect on Julian and Charles's life insurance policies. Fuller described Teresa as the driving force behind the murders, though he also indicated that Matthew had been the dominant personality in planning the actual killings. With all three conspirators in custody, prosecutors faced the complex task of determining appropriate charges and sentences for each defendant based on their specific roles in the murders. The evidence clearly showed that while Matthew and Rodney had pulled the triggers, Teresa had been the driving force behind the conspiracy. The prosecution's case also included evidence of Teresa's behavior immediately following the murders. Her attempts to access Julian's bank accounts, her inquiries about collecting his final paycheck, and her focus on insurance proceeds all demonstrated that financial gain had been her primary concern, rather than grief for her deceased family members. Witness testimony from family members provided additional evidence of Teresa's suspicious behavior. Kathy Clifton, Julian's daughter, would testify about conversations where Teresa had asked whether Kathy suspected her involvement in the murders and had made comments about having money to pay for funeral expenses. The defense teams for all three defendants recognized that the evidence against their clients was overwhelming. Rather than risk jury trials that could result in death sentences for all defendants, plea negotiations began to determine whether any of the conspirators could avoid capital punishment through cooperation. Rodney Fuller's attorneys moved first to secure a plea agreement for their client. In exchange for Fuller's complete cooperation and testimony against Teresa and Matthew, prosecutors agreed to accept a guilty plea to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Fuller's plea agreement removed him from consideration for the death penalty and guaranteed that he would testify truthfully about the roles played by Teresa and Matthew in planning and carrying out the murders. This testimony would be crucial evidence in the cases against the remaining defendants. Matthew Schallenberger's case was also complex, but prosecutors needed his cooperation to fully establish Teresa's role as the conspiracy's organizer. Negotiations continued to determine whether Matthew might also receive a life sentence in exchange for testimony against Teresa. Teresa's defense team recognized that their client faced the highest likelihood of receiving a death sentence because prosecutors viewed her as the mastermind behind the murders. Her lawyers began exploring whether a guilty plea might result in a life sentence rather than capital punishment. The challenge for Teresa's defense was that she had clearly been the person who initiated the conspiracy and provided the resources that made the murders possible. While Matthew and Rodney had committed the actual killings, Teresa had been the driving force behind the entire plot from its inception to its execution. Teresa's lawyers advised her to plead guilty and submit to sentencing by Judge Strauss rather than risk a jury trial. They believed the judge would show leniency because Teresa had cooperated with investigators and because Judge Strauss had never previously imposed a death sentence on any defendant. The decision to avoid a jury trial was based on the defense team's assessment that any jury hearing the details of these murders would be likely to impose death sentences on all defendants. They calculated that Teresa's best chance for avoiding execution was to rely on judicial mercy rather than jury deliberation. Judge Strauss accepted Teresa's guilty plea to 2 counts of capital murder for hire, along with additional charges for conspiracy and weapons violations. The judge then had to decide whether Teresa deserved life imprisonment or death for her role in organizing and financing the murders. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutors presented evidence that Teresa had been the mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. They argued that without Teresa's initiative, planning, and financial support, these murders would never have occurred. Julian and Charles Lewis would still be alive if Teresa had not recruited killers and provided them with means and opportunity. The prosecution's case emphasized that Teresa had betrayed the most fundamental family bonds by arranging the murders of her husband and stepson for financial gain. They argued that her role as the conspiracy's organizer made her more culpable than the men who had carried out her plan. Defense attorneys attempted to present evidence of Teresa's limited intellectual capacity and dependent personality disorder. They argued that Matthew Schallenberger had manipulated Teresa into participating in murders she was not mentally capable of planning or understanding fully. However, the defense was limited in the evidence they could present because Teresa had already pleaded guilty to the charges. The focus of the sentencing hearing was on determining appropriate punishment rather than establishing guilt or innocence. Judge Strauss ultimately concluded that Teresa Lewis was the head of this serpent, the driving force behind murders that had destroyed 2 innocent lives for monetary gain. He found that Teresa's role as organizer and financier made her more culpable than the men who had carried out her instructions. On the basis of this reasoning, Judge Strauss sentenced Teresa Lewis to death by lethal injection, making her the only woman on Virginia's death row. The sentence meant that the person who had planned the murders but not pulled the trigger would face execution, while the actual killers received life imprisonment. Teresa's death sentence created a situation that many observers found troubling. The triggerman would live while their recruiter would die. This disparity in sentences would become a central issue in the appeals process and public debate about Teresa's case that continued for the next 7 years until her execution. Teresa Lewis's death sentence triggered a 7-year appeals process that would transform her case into an international symbol of capital punishment controversies. The automatic appeals began with the Virginia Supreme Court's mandatory review, where her attorneys argued it was fundamentally unfair to execute someone who hadn't killed anyone while sparing the actual triggerman. The court rejected this argument, maintaining that Teresa's role as organizer and financier justified her death sentence, and that her betrayal of family bonds made her actions particularly heinous. The appeals process gained momentum in federal court, where new evidence emerged that hadn't been available during her original trial. Psychological evaluations revealed Teresa's IQ fell between 70 and 72, placing her in the borderline range for intellectual disability protection under the Supreme Court's Atkins v. Virginia decision, which prohibited executing intellectually disabled individuals. However, Virginia's standard required an IQ below 70 for such protection, meaning Teresa fell just above the threshold despite her attorney's arguments about testing margins of error. The most significant development came in 2004 when a private investigator obtained a partially signed affidavit from Matthew Schallenberger in which he admitted being the true mastermind. Matthew wrote that Teresa was in love with me and not very smart, stating that killing Julian and Charles Lewis was entirely my idea and that Teresa was an easy target. However, Matthew had second thoughts, tore up and ate the signed portions of the affidavit, and his subsequent suicide in prison in 2006 prevented Teresa's defense team from using his admissions as evidence. Additional testimony from Rodney Fuller supported claims that Matthew had been the dominant force, stating that Matthew came up with a plan to kill Teresa's husband, and that everyone knew that Teresa was not very smart. 3 forensic psychology experts also testified that Teresa's dependent personality disorder significantly impaired her decision-making abilities and made her extremely vulnerable to manipulation. Despite this new evidence revealing the power dynamics within the conspiracy and suggesting that Matthew, with his significantly higher IQ of 113, had manipulated Teresa into participating in murders she may not have been intellectually capable of planning independently, both Virginia and federal appellate courts upheld her death sentence. The courts concluded that regardless of who originated the plan, Teresa had been a willing participant who deserved punishment for her role in the crimes. The appeals process ultimately highlighted ongoing problems with how the justice system handles cases involving borderline intellectual disability and manipulation by more sophisticated criminals. By 2010, Teresa Lewis's final appeals were handled by experienced attorney James E. Rocap III, who argued that Teresa had been sentenced to death based on incomplete information about the conspiracy's true dynamics. The defense team's central argument was that Matthew Schallenberger, with his superior intelligence, had manipulated Teresa, whose dependent personality disorder and borderline intellectual functioning made her vulnerable to exploitation. In August 2010, Teresa's attorneys filed a comprehensive clemency petition with Governor Bob McDonnell, presenting evidence of her mental limitations, exemplary prison behavior, and genuine remorse. The petition included expert testimony that Teresa's dependent personality disorder made her an eager-to-please follower, and Rodney Fuller's affidavit confirming that Matthew had devised the murder plan and was the dominant one in their relationship. Governor McDonnell denied clemency on September 17, 2010, stating no medical professional had concluded Teresa met Virginia's definition of intellectual disability and emphasizing her active participation in the crimes. When attorneys requested reconsideration, the governor's office denied this on September 20th, ending hopes for executive clemency. Teresa's final hope lay with the U.S. Supreme Court, but on September 21, 2010, the court denied her petition without comment, though Justices Ginsburg and Sotomayor indicated they would have granted a stay. This meant Teresa would be executed on September 23, 2010, becoming the first woman executed in Virginia since 1912. With all legal appeals exhausted, Teresa Lewis spent her final days at the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarratt, Virginia, where Virginia's death chamber was located. Her last week alive was marked by visits from family members, spiritual advisors, and attorneys who had fought unsuccessfully to save her life. Teresa's behavior during her final days reflected the same faith and ministry that had characterized her 7 years on death row. She continued praying, singing hymns, and trying to comfort other inmates even as her own execution approached. Her spiritual advisor, Reverend Julie Perry, spent considerable time with Teresa during these final days. James Rocap, Teresa's attorney, described spending her last days helping her prepare for death, while continuing to hope for a last-minute intervention that never came. Rocap later said that Teresa had actually been ministering to her legal team rather than the other way around, providing them with comfort and strength during this difficult time. Teresa wrote letters to her children, including her daughter Christy, expressing her love and her remorse for the choices that had led to this outcome. These final communications reflected the genuine remorse that prison officials and chaplains had observed throughout her incarceration. On September 22, 2010, Teresa gave her final interview to a reporter, explaining how she maintained hope and peace despite knowing that her execution was scheduled for the following evening. She credited her faith and her relationship with her legal team for giving her strength during these final hours. Teresa requested a final meal of 2 fried chicken breasts, sweet peas with butter, a Dr. Pepper, and apple pie for dessert. This simple meal reflected her humble background and ordinary tastes, providing a humanizing detail in the final chapter of her life story. Throughout her final day, Teresa maintained the calm demeanor and faith that had impressed prison staff throughout her incarceration. She spent time in prayer and meditation, preparing herself spiritually for death while continuing to express remorse for the pain she had caused to the Lewis family. Outside the Greensville Correctional Center, opponents of Teresa's execution maintained a vigil, holding signs and praying for a last-minute intervention. The protesters included religious leaders, death penalty opponents, and ordinary citizens who believed that executing Teresa would be a miscarriage of justice. The European Union made a final appeal to Governor McDonnell, reiterating their position that Teresa's intellectual limitations made her execution a violation of human rights standards. However, these international appeals had no effect on the scheduled execution. As evening approached on September 23, 2010, Teresa was moved to a holding cell near the death chamber. She spent her final hours with Reverend Perry and James Rocap, praying and singing hymns as she had done throughout her time on death row. Teresa's final words to reporters and supporters emphasized her remorse for her crimes and her gratitude for those who had supported her during her incarceration. She expressed particular appreciation for her legal team, calling them God-sent angels, who had provided both legal representation and personal support. At approximately 8:55 p.m., Teresa was escorted into the death chamber, wearing a light blue prison shirt and dark blue pants. Witnesses described her as appearing frightened and tense, with her jaw visibly clenched as she was secured to the gurney with heavy leather straps. 14 corrections officers were present in the death chamber to assist with the execution procedures. Teresa was connected to intravenous lines in both arms that would deliver the lethal drugs. The witness room contained family members of the victims, as well as media representatives who would document Teresa's final moments. Just before the execution began, Teresa asked whether Kathy Clifton, Julian's daughter, was present. When told that Kathy was watching from the witness room, Teresa delivered her final words, "I just want Kathy to know that I love her, and I'm very sorry." These final words reflected Teresa's continued remorse for her crimes and her desire to apologize directly to the family members who had suffered the most from her actions. Her last statement was consistent with the genuine repentance that had characterized her behavior throughout her incarceration. At 9 p.m. on September 23, 2010, the lethal injection process began in the death chamber at Greensville Correctional Center. Teresa Lewis lay strapped to a gurney, her arms extended and connected to intravenous lines that would deliver the drugs designed to end her life. The execution protocol in Virginia involved a 3-drug combination administered in sequence. The first drug, sodium pentothal, was designed to render Teresa unconscious. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, would stop her breathing. The final drug, potassium chloride, would stop her heart. As the drugs began flowing into her body, witnesses observed that Teresa's feet twitched slightly, but she otherwise remained motionless. A corrections officer lightly tapped her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance as she lost consciousness and slipped toward death. In the witness room, Kathy Clifton watched the execution of the woman who had arranged the murders of her father and brother. Kathy had chosen to attend the execution to honor her family members and to see justice carried out. Her presence provided closure to a case that had dominated her life for 8 years. Reverend Julie Perry, Teresa's spiritual advisor, stood watching with tears streaming down her face, clutching a religious book. Perry had developed a close relationship with Teresa during her final years and had provided spiritual guidance as Teresa prepared for death. At 9:13 p.m., Teresa Lewis was pronounced dead by lethal injection. She had become the 12th woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, and the first woman executed in Virginia since 17-year-old Virginia Christian was electrocuted in 1912. Teresa's death marked the end of a case that had attracted international attention and raised fundamental questions about the fairness of capital punishment. Her execution proceeded despite unprecedented appeals for clemency from foreign governments, human rights organizations, and thousands of individual supporters. The execution was witnessed by media representatives who would report Teresa's final moments to audiences worldwide. Their accounts emphasized her apparent fear as she entered the death chamber, her final words of apology to the victim's family, and the peaceful nature of her death once the drugs took effect. Larry Traylor, spokesman for the Virginia Department of Corrections, made the official announcement that the execution had been carried out according to Virginia law. He confirmed Teresa's final words and time of death, providing closure to a case that had generated controversy for years. This documentary has presented the complete story of the Teresa Lewis case, based on extensive research of court records, trial transcripts, media reports, and first-hand accounts. And if you found this story compelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe to No Way Out, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the most haunting cases of crime and punishment. Real cases, real consequences.